everyone. Welcome to The Black Joke, the true story of one ship's battle against the slave trade. My name is Bethany Groff-Deroe. I'm the executive director of the Museum of Old Newbury, and it's my pleasure to be part of the volunteer team of the Newburyport Literary Festival. This is our 17th year of bringing authors and readers together, and it's our biggest year ever, with over 100 panelists joining us. It's my honor to introduce A. Rooks. A. Rooks hopes to always be a student of history, which hasn't stopped her from studying everything else. While her debut, The Black Joke, the story of one ship's battle against the slave trade, explores a little discussed facet of the transatlantic slave trade. Previous writing credits include the column Between the Briefs, for which she won 2 National Award for sex-positive journalism. A 2-time Jeopardy champion. Fun fact, that's how we met. I know another Jeopardy champion. Whose schooling spans theater, law, library, and information science, education, human sexuality. Rooks's literary passions are united by what the past can teach us about the present, how history shapes our future, and above all, really interesting stories. Off you go.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, first of all, for joining me early on a weekend day. I super appreciate it. I know that this is not usually the preferred festival time for a lot of folks. So I really appreciate anyone who got up early. My thinking, and so we'll see how this goes based on response. But I have a background in education, right? I usually teach at the college level and theater. So my inclination is to go Q&A very early, to just like let people ask questions, to see where the conversation takes us, and to sort of discover interesting tidbits together. Now, if nobody has any questions right off the bat, never fear. Please see that previous sort of experience, both filling time and giving information. But I did want to say that very much I am super, super open to any questions you may have about the book, about the process, about any of it right from the outset. Never fear. So I'm going to give it about 2 seconds to see if anybody takes me up on that while I talk about the book for a second. Just some brief overview stuff for those who are not familiar with the book. I wrote this, starting in 2019, really. So just before the pandemic, so doing research in the pandemic. Fun times if you have to go to an archive, because most of them were closed. So I was able to get in one research trip out to London. And then I was planning to sort of do London et al, because there's a lot of slave trade action and information going on in Liverpool. There are some places I hadn't gotten to visit yet in London, and also spent a decent amount of time in Freetown, which I have not been to before. I have been to Africa, but I've never been to Sierra Leone. So unfortunately, COVID comes for us all. And so what ended up happening was, I think, a different book than I intended to write initially. I was going to try to be more sort of really involved in sort of like individual stories in as much as I could, and try to really get this sort of sense of space and place. And I still tried to do that insofar as possible, but it took me in the direction of thinking more about what is this world, right, that this ship is a part of. And as a result of that, I actually think that the book that ended up happening is a better work than might have happened otherwise. But I do think it would have been improved by having that original element as well that I just couldn't do because of sort of the nature of the beast when it comes to living in a pandemic and being responsible. So that is one just like quick process thing that I thought was really fun. Oh, look, there's a question. Oh, good. I'm already sort of answering it. Thank you, Paulette. So the research question, right, is already being a little bit answered in the sense that beyond that, it could have been a lot harder. Honestly, number one, the British are pretty ruthless record keepers. I think that they have a historical sort of reputation for that, so that was helpful. There are a number of sources that were already online that had been digitized in some way. In some cases, it was because it was the British parliamentary papers, which were collected, every year depending on subject matter. So You have specific parliamentary papers that are basically collections of the letters from or to and from the Mixed Commission, Sierra Leone, the Squadron, etc. You also have records like those found in the sort of interstitial pages wherein the British are keeping track of who they, took, right? So who they recaptived, right? And for folks who haven't seen this version. And so those records are actually in to this day, they're in Freetown, but currently they're also online, thanks to, in this case, Liberated Africans Project, which is run by a professor named Henry Lovejoy out of CU Boulder. And in partnership with National Archives, with, I want to say, the Schomburg, maybe Harvard, a couple other folks. But so that information was available, which is lovely. But when it comes to the idea of sort of getting a feel for a place, right, in the sense that it's one thing to know that Freetown is nestled in a sort of bay and it's very lovely to look at, and it's got this sort of mountain rising in the background. I know that, I've seen that. I've seen pictures of that, but I think to sort of experience a place can't really be replaced. And so I think that that was one of the most difficult things about doing this project, was feeling like I was speaking on places in ways that I wasn't necessarily as familiar, I think, as I would want to be, if that makes sense. When it comes to finding out about this project, it was both easy and part of the reason for that is because it isn't a story, right, that most of us have heard before. It wasn't one that I had heard before I discovered it. And for those who have never seen me say this before, because I do say it, I think, every time, but I was reading W.E.B. Du Bois's The Suppression of the Slave Trade from Africa, I believe is the official title. It's from 1894. I will find a link and paste it in the chat. But it was his thesis for his PhD at Harvard. Still one of the sort of all-time greatest quotes, I think, from a scholar might be W.E.B. Du Bois's, when he was questioned about his experience being the first Black PhD at Harvard. I believe he said, "I assure you the pleasure was all Harvard's." So fun fact there. But it's a really, really, truly amazing resource, especially when one realizes that there were no computers involved, that all of this work was sort of, all this compilation work, all this computational work, whatnot, was done sort of by hand, if you will. And in that book, sort of, he not only goes through all the laws, both domestically and internationally, in the case of the United States, impacting the slave trade, but he also mentions suppression squadrons, to which one might say, what? If one is me, because I had never heard of a suppression squadron. I did not know that that was a thing that existed. And I like to think of myself, obviously, as a history attuned person, but nonetheless, I did not know that. And intellectually speaking, it makes sense, right? Like, how did the slave trade stop? It makes sense that someone sort of had to actually intervene, right? But until sort of confronted with that fact, I'd never really thought about it. And that was a rabbit hole that was obviously worth falling down, but also had a lot more information available, I think, than I had realized. It just wasn't really compiled in sort of one place, if you will. And so part of what I like to do when I read a nonfiction book, and this could just be me, I don't know if this resonates with other people, but I like to feel that I've gotten a pretty decent overview of whatever sort of niche subject it is. And if I wanted to go find more, I could, because the resources are available and somebody's told me where they are. But I also feel like I sort of have a good idea of what's going on without having to run to the sort of internet to look things up too often. And so when I was writing this, I sort of took to answering what questions I would have at the same time, like, well, why were they doing this? Or what did they do all day? Or, and then what happened? And so to me, I thought getting that picture was really, really an interesting thing to do, because not only was this a story I had never heard, but it also took place in a period of time that I never particularly studied. And I don't think I'm super unique in that. This sort of weird space in between Napoleon and Victoria is just because these eras, right, and these personalities and the sort of historical space and oxygen that they take up are so huge, especially in how we view empire, British Empire, colonialism, whatnot. The sort of interregnum, if you will, between most famous sort of world leaders, I think leads to a little slice of time that doesn't get investigated that often. As Americans, do we really spend a lot of time thinking about George IV, even though he was a total scandal? Oh my goodness. If there were going to be a TV series about an English like monarch, I think I might pick George IV because escandalo. But there was also, and then you also have like William the Sailor King. Like, again, does anybody are those the ones that we feel sort of compelled to pay attention to? I don't think so. And so it was an opportunity to learn a lot, not just about the book, and not just about the Black joke, not just about the slave trade, not just about the people in the Royal Navy involved in that, but also about like just this time period and what was going on and how that impacts what came later. So that was probably a far longer answer to that question than was maybe necessary, but hopefully it was fulsome and delightful. So, um, with that being said, oh, somebody came in right with another. Y'all have excellent timing. Everyone had their coffee slash tea slash non-caffeinated beverage, because I don't know your lives. So I appreciate that. So this question is, how did you grow as an author while writing this, and what will you do next? So I think, as an author, I think, well, the practice of getting the book out, right, is huge. I think when people ask me what's the hardest part about writing a book, I usually say starting it. And then if I am asked a follow up about the second hardest part, I say finishing it. Because those really, to me, those are the really difficult bits. It's getting words on a page, fine, but getting some sort of narrative structure that feels cohesive and complete from beginning to end, even if it's never as complete as you want it to be, is a really big thing. And I think the never as complete as you want it to be thing is big for me personally as well, because given my sort of background in research and caring about that sort of stuff in a really particular way, I've always of the opinion that there's like more information I could just stuff in there. Right, even though I described the first couple chapters as almost like sort of drinking information from a fire hose, because it's just all the data coming at you. It was just like, but everybody's going to want to know, all of these things. And so giving myself the sort of permission to not have scope creep, to be like, you know what, maybe that should go in a footnote, you know what I mean? That's okay too. And then I couldn't have footnotes, because footnotes are apparently very academic looking, and they are off-putting to some readers. I love them. Because I don't like to flip back and forth between the front and back of the book, but that's just me. But thankfully, Scribner was lovely enough to be like, no, we can do trailing endnotes. We got you. But so I have many, many favorite footnotes now, but it was tough to think about what should go in the text and what was like, that's lovely, but maybe let people, discover that little nugget on their own if they're going to discover it. Which leads to some really, really great footnotes with information that didn't make it in the text. But it also, I think, leads to a more cohesive narrative, which is really hard when you're talking about basically like the all the sides, let's say, of the triangular slave trade, but over a 4-year period, right? So huge geographical space that we're talking about, short time period. To the second half of the question, sort of flip that script. wherein for the next projects that I'm working on, instead, it's a specific location, which is to say the United States, but much longer time period. So that's a little interesting as a compromise. And so right now for one manuscript, I probably have, let's see here. I think this is a citation inclusive number, but I'm already at 103,000 words. And I would not call that book more than half, well, it's a little more than half done. But I wouldn't call it more than, let's say, 5/8 done. And 100,000 words is already a lot for something that, needs some revision and zhuzhing and whatnot. So I don't think, I think the fact that brevity is not the soul of my wit is not going to be assisted with telling a multi-century story. But also, I like to think anyway that one of my skills as a writer is sort of cohering a lot of information sort of cogently in a way that folks can sort of like process and like see, connections and through lines with that. And so that's sort of where my instinct is going now. The project that is not the one that's mostly already written, that is based on my PhD dissertation. So it's a lot of writing for the next couple of years. But for those who are going to ask the question, I'll preempt it. My PhD dissertation is studying how the law functions as a mechanism of informal sex education in the United States. So if you're wondering how that's going to be a trade nonfiction book, just you wait. So hopefully I answered that, but please feel free also to follow up. There's no shame in my game when it comes to question answering. So yeah, I think I grew as an author. I learned myself better, and I learned my foibles better, and I learned sort of how to overcome them better. And we will see how well those lessons apply, but also just that a book is finishable, which once you've done one, it does mean something, where you're like, okay, I could do this again. Right? Once you've gotten that one done, it's like, all right, I have this in me. I can complete a thing and turn it in. So I think that like getting over that block of just thinking of oneself as a writer who works in that way was actually pretty huge. Okay. And then Dinah, thank you, Dinah. I don't know anything about your book. Could you talk a bit about why you chose the story and what the basic story is? Thanks. Yeah, no problem. Of course. So we'll use this moment to plug again. This is the book. Here we go. The basic story is that we have a ship that's named the Henrietta, who is a notorious slaver, reputed to be the fastest slave ship on the water, transports over 3,000 people from the coast of Africa to Bahia in Brazil, to enslavement on sugar plantations for the most part. And that ship is captured by the British West Africa Squadron, which was formed specifically for the purpose of halting the slave trade due to political agitation in Britain. And when captured, it is condemned as a slaver, which is its own special process. Please feel free to ask. And after that condemnation, it was auctioned off to the highest bidder. The highest bidder in this case was Commodore Collier, the head of said Suppression Squadron. Thankfully, sometimes it was not. Sometimes those ships would go right back to slavers. And so Collier decided to rechristen and repurpose the Henrietta as the Black Joke. And the Black Joke then cruised for the next 4 years, searching for slave ships, capturing them, and getting those slavers condemned. So it sort of went from the hunted to the hunter in the best of possible ways. And as a result, liberates, or well, repatriates, shall we say, over 3,000 enslaved Africans from what they would have been doing, which is enslavement by whomever had captured them, being brought over to the Americas, to the service of sort of colonial empire in one way or another in Sierra Leone for the most part. It should be noted that in this process, at least probably a fifth of enslaved Africans would die, simply from the getting on the slave ship being captured and being taken to Sierra Leone. Just in that process, a fifth would die. And spoiler alert, in chapter 9, we learned that there is another option, and that is to stage a revolt. And then the colonial government doesn't want to deal with you. So unfortunately, it was an example that really could have been copied very easily. It would have been more financially sensible for the British to continue with a tender system. It would have been more effective. Alas, that is not what happened due to sort of political concerns. William IV, whom I mentioned earlier as the Duke of Clarence, had actually been one of the big voices in the House of Lords against ending the slave trade in the first place. So you can guess what his sort of feeling on the policy was by the time he becomes king. And you end up with a situation wherein there's simply not the administrative or political will to sort of back this most efficient version of this squadron. And that is reflected in what ends up happening to the Black Joke, which I will not spoil, although I think I do in the first chapter. So, but that is the brief overview of what the story is. Why I chose it is simply because I'd never heard of it. And I know that I keep repeating that, but I think that's really, really important because I wrote an article actually at one point, I think for the Daily Beast, wherein I discussed the fact that when, at least in my experience of American history education, right, for the most part, which is in a couple of different states, I moved around a bit as a kid, the amount of time that one spent on the slave trade was maybe a day. Not slavery, the slave trade specifically. And I think the way that most of us sort of get that education in the United States is it's just this sort of moment that happens between slavery is bad, they're kidnapping people from one coast, right? Trade is triangular, everybody sort of gets that. Boats are very cramped. So you end up with some sort of like history lesson that either has a picture of like, am I not a man and a brother? The guy on his knees, sort of with a supplicant pose, or, the really cramped sort of slave ship deck diagram with the little figures, showing how tightly packed it is. And beyond that, we sort of go straight to slavery. And in some ways that makes sense, right? In the United States, only approximately 2% of the international slave trade came here before, in the years right before the United States itself ended the international slave trade, which would have been 1808. It wasn't a popular movement per se here. I mean, it might have been, but it wasn't the result of popular movement. It was the result of political movement. Thomas Jefferson himself, perhaps in a fit of irony, said to Congress about the idea of sort of ending this violation of human rights that was the international slave trade. So you end up in a situation wherein it doesn't seem as sort of crucial to what slavery becomes in the United States due to natural increase, due to cotton, there's a lot of reasons for that. But when the US gives up the international slave trade, it's sort of a sleeves out of one's vest almost scenario. They maintained a robust domestic slave trade anyway. The only state that still allowed the colony state that still allowed the international slave trade at that point was South Carolina, regardless of the 13. There was only one where it was legal. And Britain, on the other hand, was well over a third of the entire international slave trading market. They had the largest market share in the all-time list. They are behind only Portugal / Brazil, right? Because Brazil breaks off from Portugal during this period, but they're only behind Portugal / Brazil in like total number of enslaved people trafficked. And Portugal did start first. So they sort of had a bit of a head start, since we can sort of trace what we understand as the modern international slave trade to Prince Henry the Navigator and Portugal. So to me, the fact that slavery existed on an industrial scale is kind of huge to make real, internally to folks, because it's one thing to just say, well, yeah, millions of people, but what does that actually mean, right? Like, how many people have to be involved in this trade? How much of your city do you see in this trade, right? Like, if you're living back in that time, one of the sort of most wild and just sort of visceral facts that I ran into this was that if you lived in a port city that was involved in the slave trade, you could smell a slave ship coming from a half a mile, even a mile out, because they smelled so bad. And this is not like an olfactory, lovely kind of a time, right? This is the 19th century. It's not like everything is super sanitized. And yet the smell of these ships, because they were so dirty, because they were so disgustingly kept, was enough to sort of reek, especially in a way that was incredibly noticeable and often remarked on in various port cities. And sort of making the slave trade sort of visceral and real and more accurate in how we picture it and how we think about it was, I think, a big driver in why I felt like this story needed to be told, because I'm not coming at it from, a high and mighty place, right? Yes, of course, I study a lot of stuff, but I didn't know this either, and to me that just seemed really wild and like a big deficit. So I'm making sure that I am keeping track of all of my questions and answers as I go. I did that one. Cool. So Angie asks, can I recommend any other books that might accurately and completely tell the history of slavery and the slave trade? Well, did you ask a reference librarian to refer books? Because the answer is yes. It's so much yes. Thank you. I love this question. There are a number of books that I think are really, really interesting and really, really illustrative. One big one that I have talked about before that I think is really powerful and really necessary to how we think about this is called Slavery at Sea. And in that, it sort of picks up that work that I was talking about earlier with the idea of where do we study slavery, right? In the United States, usually we tend to study it on the ground in the United States, right? But ignoring this space and this period of time that came before. And Slavery at Sea specifically looks at what slavery was like on the trip, right? Just that middle passage bit. What was happening there? How were people being dealt with there? How were people being impacted there? And it specifically focuses on people who were even more easily taken advantage of: the elderly, children, people assigned female at birth, whatnot. So it looks at those particular experiences in particular to highlight a lot of the things that were truly and deeply terrible on with the conditions on these ships, but also with the treatment, with attitudes of the time, and how that sort of dovetailed in with a lot of stuff. If someone just really, really wanted to, I'm going to note this one, even though it doesn't quite go to your question, Angie, but I think it's important to say that if someone is really, really just intrigued by the West Africa Squadron or the idea of British suppression in general, the one there is Opposing the Slavers, Opposing the Slave Trade, Opposing the Slavers. It's by Peter Grindle. I've cited it a million times in here, so it's Grindle. And that book is about 850 pages. It is a honker, but it is extraordinarily thorough. So especially if, the naval action and that kind of stuff is particularly your bag, that's a great book for that. And it's also a great book. It's got a lot of these sort of lovely, juicy anecdotes and tidbits. And so you might have to go a little deeper to find out more, but it does have plenty of them in there. Another one is classic is Marcus Rediker's or Rediker's. I'm sorry, there's a lot of names that I've never had to say out loud sometimes. So I don't know if anybody can identify with that, but I apologize to anyone. And then the Slavery at Sea was Sawanda Mustakim. So that I did not say her name earlier and I should have. But Rediker wrote The Slave Ship. And that is also about sort of conditions on enslaved vessels, how they were outfitted, how they changed over time. So that's another really good resource for that. There's some really great resources on shipboard revolts, which were actually far more common than I think we are led to think. Generally, we think of the Amistad as sort of this really exceptional case, when it was exceptional in that they succeeded, right? And there was a case about it. But I think when I looked at figures, folks said that there were upwards of a fifth to even a quarter, perhaps, of enslaved populations on a ship revolted. Whether or not they were successful, right, is a totally different question. But the attempt was readily made, and precautions were taken. There are other sources where it's a little harder to get that information, unfortunately, because the book itself is very difficult to get access to. One particular case there, I would say, which is more about the squadron again, would be Cruisers, Corsairs, and Slavers, which has Basil Lubbock, which is a little offensive in the way of sometimes books written uh, 30, 40 years ago can be, but is very, very informative, a lot specifically on what was going on with the West Africa Squadron and how they were treating with this. Last but not least, I do want to highlight two books that probably wouldn't normally go directly to your question. Oh, and of course, oh my goodness, of course, please, please, please go back to the Du Bois. That book, The Suppression of that book is phenomenal when it comes to getting information. He literally breaks down laws regarding racial difference and enslavement by region and then by state. And then he does a separate section for international actions. It's really, really just a true treasure trove font of information. It is publicly available digitally online right now. I will still remember to add a link in here. But two more that just wouldn't necessarily come up that often potentially, but I think are really, or three more. I'm going to do three. One was Barcia or Barcia, Barcia, The Yellow Demon of Fever, which is about illness and disease and whatnot in regards to the slave trade. One was Envoys of Abolition by Mary Wills, which is a good it's a really insightful look into how people who were involved in suppression felt about it. Some were actually in favor, some were very much not. There are instances of folks who were in the suppression squadron, saw all of the horrors of slavery, and once they sort of did their bid and retired from naval action or whatnot, decided that what they most wanted to do was be enslavers. That was the thing that happened. And then last but not least, there's a book called Black Salt by Ray Costello, and that's about the experience of African seafarers on British ships, I believe is the subtitle. And that is just a really interesting way of sort of really troubling, right, how we think about historical moments like this. Because I think if any of us had been asked to picture the British Navy in the 19th century, it would have been a very, shall we say, white envisionment of what that was and what that looked like, and very British, right, specifically like from England. And that could not be further from the truth, right? So there's much more diverse sort of groupings on here that had to do with how Britain was encountering empire and enacting empire as well. And so I think that there's just a lot of really, really interesting stuff about all of this. Pirates, Many-Headed Hydra is great, about sort of pirate society before this period in the 18th century. So I will stop, but clearly so many books. So if any of that piqued your fancy or you want to know more books, please feel free to ask even more. All right. What people or story have really made an impression on you while researching your book? Ooh. Well, so people, I think the standout person who's just leapt out of the historical record has to be William Fitzwilliam Owen. Captain Owen is a special, special man. I don't know about his decision making sometimes, but I mean, in and of himself, just a really, really fascinating guy. And not always the most helpful. Maybe his heart was in the right place. The historical record seems to think that he was a committed abolitionist. He was just also committed to lining his pockets, which made people sort of question his morals and morality and whatnot. But in an era when all of this, right, has to be considered through the lens of colonialism, right, and sort of a paternalistic colonialism at that. But in an era where in most cases you have this idea of, these Africans cannot govern themselves. Thank God we're here to civilize them, blah, 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 blah. Owen basically functionally sets up a government on Fernando Po, wherein people who have been repatriated there, not the indigenous people, they're the Bubi, but Bubi, but people who have been sort of repatriated there are like running the government, and they have their own schools. And yes, he is preaching to them every Sunday and whatnot. So we are not, sort of removed from a lot of that colonialist vibe, but the very much the attitude from Owen and on Fernando Poe is that these folks are perfectly capable of governing themselves. They've been doing it since before we got here, and sort of put them on the lines of British infrastructure and let folks go. And part of the animus towards Fernando Poe from some of the ruling elites in Freetown might have had to do with that very instinct. Some governors of Freetown were sort of more in that Owen vibe, but quite a few others, including Finlay, who's the governor at the end of the book, and future Lieutenant Governor of Gambia, Henry Huntley, who's the 7th captain of the Black Joke. In both of those cases, there's very clearly a lot of racism, a lot of belief in sort of the inherent inferiority of African people, and that really informs their policy and what they do. And Owen is very much different than that. But he's also the kind of guy who's going to start a fight over a beard and then get in fisticuffs because he didn't like how somebody else was running the colony. So he's just like, he's a historical gift as as someone writing about this period. A wild card like Owen is really is helpful because he keeps the action rolling along. I think the other person who probably really made an impact and how I thought about this was Hayes. Very multi-talented guy. He's the 2nd Commodore of the squadron. There are 3 over the course of the book that are happening, during the action of the book. And Hayes's level of frustration with the job he's been assigned and the inability to do that job seems to rise even beyond Collier's, where Collier clearly was a man who cared about his work and cared about doing his work well. We don't know as much about how he felt about the slave trade itself, or maybe we do, and I don't know because his letters are available in an archive that I didn't get to go to. But as it stands at the moment, from what I was able to take from what I did find and from other sources I was able to find, we don't know as much about Collier's personal feelings about the slave trade. We do know that Collier must have served with Black sailors. We know this because he served under Nelson, that Nelson. And from a child, he was basically hand recruited by Admiral Nelson himself. And so we have seen evidence, it's covered in Black Salt as well, but there's evidence in paintings and whatnot. There are probably at least 10 to 15, at minimum, 10 to 15 Black sailors who were on the Victory at Trafalgar, for instance. And Collier served on Nelson's ship for a couple of years. So we know that he had that exposure. Hayes, on the other hand, comes from a shipping family from way back. He designed ships himself. He loves ships. There's maneuvers named after him. There's something, the reason his sobriquet or whatever is the Magnificent is not because he is magnificent, although that is part of it. It's because he was involved in an action with a ship named Magnificent, and pulled out a truly amazing save that saved the lives of many, and a piece of seamanship that was still being taught years later, decades later. So had a huge impact in that way. And his level of frustration, though, when he writes about, if only people in England could see what he sees when they're doing all of these actions, when they're trying to liberate these people, then he feels that nobody could possibly be politically opposed to what they're doing because it's so necessary, because it's so vital. He's wrong. Of course, there are people who are right around him who see exactly what he sees and don't see it as necessary or vital at all. Huntley, for instance, thought it was a total waste of time. But he really felt that way. And I think that level of conviction is something that I think we feel we would all have if we were in that same situation. But what's evident is that if one is sort of steeped in that milieu, if nothing seems weird or wrong or immoral about that per se, because it's like a matter of debate, maybe we wouldn't. right? But then you have someone who nonetheless says, this is wrong. I see it's wrong. Everyone should be able to see it's wrong. Can we please do anything to make my job easier to stop this? Please, 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 please. And I think that that really resonates with a modern reader. So I would go with those two first and foremost. I do want to give a shout out in particular, though, in that way to a group of people and a person. The group of people is the crew, not CREWKRU, the crew, which is a tribal sort of grouping, if you will, from coastal Liberia. And they were well known as excellent sailors. They probably would have been the only people on a ship who could swim. One anecdote that did not quite make it into the book, but really honestly probably should have, is that at one point during an action, I believe it was the Marinerito, an African child from the slave ship falls overboard, and two crewmen from the Black Joke jump off their boat, swim over, save the kid, and bring them back on board the Black Joke. They would have been the only people who could have swum, because up until this point, the Royal Navy was discouraging people knowing how to swim, because then they might leave the ship. What? So no swimming lessons for you. But they did a majority of the work in a lot of these on a lot of these ships. They were not paid the same. They were on paper, but they weren't eligible for prize money, so they were not paid the same, or they weren't eligible for prize money for a substantial period of time. Between Collier and Hayes, that eventually gets rectified. But they are very much, I think, an unsung group that was part of all of this in a way that makes it not just about sort of colonial intervention for a colonial problem, right? Like the British are doing the slave trade, so they're a big part of the problem, right? Now they've decided to be part of the solution, which is great. But the crew, one, decided to be part of the solution, but two, were also sort of vigorously policing and maintaining their own freedom and their own status. And I think that that's just something really, really interesting, and how that community develops both in Britain then, as well as in Freetown and in Liberia, is just another sort of continuation of this story that has repercussions through World War II and World War I, really, and World War II and beyond, especially sort of in Britain in a lot of ways. So I think, yeah, I'm gonna go with that. And then last but not least, there's Jean-Francois. And Jean-Francois, we have one mention of him for sure with his name. There's one in a book, and there's one in Downes's logbook, which is to say he's listed in the ship's roster when they're capturing the El Almirante. And when that happens, Jean-Francois is the one who loads the sort of 12 feet of chain, which must have been incredibly heavy, by the way, into a cannon, and it is shot at the sort of opposing ship, which shears off their mast, basically ends that fight. And he is the only free African we know for sure served on the Black Joke. Was he the only one? Quite possibly not, but he's the only one we know for sure served on the Black Joke. And I think making room and sort of making note of the fact that people were participatory in their own liberation, in their own fight from way, way back is really, really key, because I do think that there's an urge to be like, well, Britain came in and kind of saved the day. And that's very much not what happened at all. And if they had wanted to, they could have saved the day much sooner if they really wanted to put some effort into it. So.
Wow, I feel like we just started.
It does seem like that. I have one more question, but then I don't know if I'm allowed to even take it.
You totally are. I'll fade out for one more question.
Okay, it's a quick one, which was, hey Carol, which should you enjoy doing more, the research or writing the book? The research. The research is way more fun. There's a reason that I became a librarian, at least in training, and it's because I like research. I think it's really, really interesting to sort of fall down rabbit holes and discover new things. And I will say that that's part of the reason that I have the robust footnotes. So I'm going to highlight something that most people might not notice, but if you go to the 147th note, if you have the book, there are actually 2 sea shanties that were written specifically by the Black jokes that are right in there. And that's the kind of stuff that I think is amazing. So I love writing, but it's the research.
That is awesome. And I 100% agree with you. And my husband, you may know, is a sea shanty singer. So there you go. I think all the Portermen are getting a copy of the Black Joke.
I'll take it.
Oh, that was absolutely wonderful. What a great way to start a wonderful day of history authors. We're all such wonderful, delicious nerds. I just love it.
Well, I've been
And you-
missing this entire chat on the side this whole time. Hi, everybody. I'm so sorry. I just had the Q&A box open. So I was
No, I think we were all just sort of waxing rapturous. That's the word I'm looking for, about Footnotes. I mean, we, you know,
Yeah,
your love
you're
is
so
shared
good.
with many.
There's one in here about the 4 governors of Sierra Leone. Just Fife. Christopher, look for that one. It's a real
Oh,
good
that's hilarious. We'll have
It's
to have
wild.
a Fife conversation later.
Yeah.
Anyway, I could talk to you all day. I think everyone here could listen to you all day. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. Thank you. All of you, go get this book. It is so wonderful. And now that we've heard this chat, I know there's going to be, I mean, read it again. If you read it already, like I did, read it again, because I will admit, I didn't read every single footnote, and now I'm a little embarrassed about that.
Well, I mean, some of them are just, the regular kind. Others are just,
I know, but now I feel inspired to read them all. So thank you for
Little
inspiring that level of devotion. So everyone, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your support of the Newburyport Literary Festival. Thank you so much, Rooks. I'll see you in New Orleans.